Well, hello everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever it is, whenever it is you are. I am Kristi. It is Sunday, and that means it's time for Social Science Sunday. Hope you all are doing well. I'm doing well. We're getting into autumn now. It's getting nice and cozy. You can see my outfits have changed from summer outfits. I'm wearing now my autumn loungewear, which is like a velvety dark thing, very cozy. Also wearing this because I forgot I lost track of time. Forgot that I was having a show today. Let me just check something really quick on the lighting. That's too much. Is that more natural lighting? Let's go with that. All right. I hope everyone is doing well. Let's see everyone in the chat. A few people, and welcome. So come on in, settle in, grab some coffee or a drink or whatever it is that you want, and we're going to talk some social science nerdiness. Now, before we start, I do want to say that we are coming up to the end of the course. We spent a lot of time, especially digging into what exists in a social reality, right? What can we say exists between human beings, and what does it mean to say something exists in a social reality? It's quite different from what happens in the natural world. However, people's social attitudes do shape the natural world. Perfect example of this is, the fact that, let's go back historically, we'll use less charged times. But, if you have a worldview that Christianity or creationism is fact, well, then, like your perception of the way you shaped your world, it's going to misalign itself with a lot of science. And that's going to have a material effect. You're not going to be able to be as successful with your models of what nature should do because you have a bad model, right? It's like, I don't know if you can hear that. Maybe not, but there was like a massive plane flying over. Anyway, let's stay focused, Kristi. All right, so what exists? How can we know what exists? And we know that from the constructivist epistemology, the perspective is that people create social reality between themselves, that process is unequal, as some people have more power than others. Some people accept structures, other people resist them, whatever. However, that the idea there is that when people create a social reality, it can be discovered by talking to people and analyzing what humans produce to understand the ways in which they decide to structure their societies. Then we went on to look at, I think, some research design. How do we go into the field? How do we, start to collect data? And now we're going through different methods. What I'd like to talk to you about today are two very complementary methods: interviewing and focus groups. They're basically the same thing, but with one person versus a few. All right, that's the main difference between a focus group. We'll get into more of the details. And then after that, I think next week we're going to have, I don't know how quickly I'll be able to blow through this or get through this, but the final part of the course is going to be analyzing talk, which is when we look at speech, analyzing text and having a very broad idea of what text means, including symbols, images, other ways to convey meaning through cultural references. And then we're going to analyze a very old school. Oh, what happened? What happened to my light? My light went out. What's going on here? Hold on. I don't know why that happened. All right, we're back. We're back. Although that's kind of cold now. It's a kind of cold light. I don't know. Oh, that's a very cold light. That was a very warm light. All right, I guess we're going to go somewhere in the middle. I guess that's somewhere in the middle. Okay, focusing again. All right, so we're going to look at analyzing talk and text, and then we're going to look at a cultural little time capsule from the 1950s called A Date with Your Family, which I initially saw on Mystery Science Theater 3000. And we're going to basically practice looking at a piece of content with the sensitivity towards noting and explicitly describing the norms, the values, the assumptions that piece of art makes, and what that tells us about both the people who created it and the norms and values that they wanted to impose. Again, what is going on here? What is being imposed upon others? What are you doing? I don't think that this is really supposed to be necessary. Ridiculous. This is ridiculous. Okay. Stay professional, Kristi. Then I think we're going to need maybe 2, possibly 3 more lectures for that. The last piece that I want to cover in this sort of review of the course is this. This is actually my most popular set of slides. as you can see, analyzing talk and text, 1,900 views, 87 views, 138 views. But reliability and validity in qualitative research has over 22,000 views. It's an issue that really does need to be addressed. And a colleague and I are working on a paper at the moment that builds on the principles in this lecture that apparently are really desperately needed by social scientists looking for some sort of sources for understanding how to evaluate reliability and validity in qualitative research. And I'll give you a little preview. I think we're going to make a pretty good contribution. It's going to be evidence-based, data-led, and the assumptions are going to be demonstrated not only through, just assertions, but in the data, which is, of course, the best way to ground your assertions. Because then you're like, well, the data shows it. I'm not making any claims. I'm just telling you what's in the data. Go look inside for yourself. And then with writing up qualitative research, I think I might just skip that one or do it very briefly at the end of reliability and validity. It's not so relevant for people here. And of course, if you actually are writing up qualitative research, there are a lot of good resources out there. And you can also just go look at the slides. So that's my plan. After that, we're kind of getting into election season. I think we're going to probably switch gears a little bit, and I might go a bit more politics in the last quarter of the year. Yeah, Q4 of 2022. That way we can just, stay on top of things. I can discuss polls. We can look at some of the races, whatnot, and so forth. And yeah, that's the plan. If you have any problems with the plan, too bad. I'm joking. But I take it y'all trust me to sort that out. All right, how come? Hello, Adam. Good to see ya. Thanks for stopping by. All right, let's have a look at focus groups and interviews. Ultimately, the reason why focus groups and interviews, it's not that difficult to figure out, I'm grouping them together is because they tend to be structurally very similar. The biggest difference between an interview and a focus group is the number of people you talk to, and as a consequence, the kinds of data you can get out. So let me just give you a broad overview. Why might you want to do an interview versus a focus group? And that is a very good research design question, because the advantage of doing a focus group is that you can talk to way more people in the same amount of time. If you're doing a focus group with, say, 4 to 11, and 11 would be a lot, 11 people in a focus group, you're going to get data from each one of them, but you're not going to get very rich data. At least you don't want to get very rich data from one loudmouth who dominates the hour and a half that you have and everyone else doesn't talk. So what you ideally want is sufficient, detailed description from a variety of individuals on a topic that doesn't require a whole lot of depth. Focus groups are really good for, and I don't want to say superficial. That's not the right word I'm looking for. But if you're looking for a more of a broad spectrum sample, a discussion, let me give you an example, perhaps. If you wanted to do research into the experience of migrants coming into a country and their experience with the system and any barriers or biases or bigotries that they encountered, well, then you're going to have to talk to one person at a time, because you're going to need that space. You're going to need to establish a rapport. You're going to need to establish a sense of relationship there and confidence and trust that if they tell you stuff that could maybe it's illegal, you're going to protect their anonymity, that you're going to be a person that they can trust with that information, and then they can go in a lot of depth. Their stories, you can ask them, tell me more about this, describe the room you were in, describe the language barriers, describe the what you were told about the form at the time that you were told to sign it. Whatever it is, with an interview, you really have this ability to go deep and to follow up leads. If someone brings up something you hadn't heard before, an interview, you can really go in depth and kind of get more information and chase that down. That is the nice thing about interviews. The downside of interviews is that they produce a lot of data, and I'm going to sneeze. So at some point, I might mute myself, but it just might sneak up on me. So be warned. And if my face looks a little bit funny, it's because I feel a sneeze coming on. Going in depth like that is great for smaller communities, for underexplored, underreported, underdescribed experiences. because if the goal of, and your goal of qualitative data is thick, rich description, then having a very narrow but very rich description of a phenomenon will help you provide the data that you need in order to investigate the claims and present your evidence in terms of where the research should go after this without producing pages and pages and pages of evidence. And this is the downside of interviews. People can talk for hours. I mean, people can use a lot of words. People can describe things. And if you have 4 interviews, that's probably manageable for a master's thesis. If you have 20 interviews or 25 interviews, that's pretty good for a PhD thesis, depending on how broad or narrow. Right? But with an interview, you're going to get pages and pages and pages of text that you are going to have to transcribe. And you might only end up transcribing tactical portions of it because there aren't enough hours in the day to transcribe all the material, but then you have some problems with transparency. So a lot of the problems of exploratory, inductive, qualitative research is that you have to kind of collect a lot of data to see what's out there before you can make a decision on what you want to pursue to, like make sure that you're going in the right direction or find a new lead. So interviews are great for narrow, focused questions where you want to go in depth. And you don't want to do like individual level generalization. But what you're looking for, and this is the argument we're going to be drawing on in the paper, you want to make analytic generalization. You want to understand concepts at work. So let's, for instance, say, a really underexplored topic might be trans representatives who are elected to office. I guess it's a super new phenomenon. And as a consequence, you're not going to have there's no data on this before. You can't go back to the 1970s and find elected openly trans members of parliaments or other, like state level governments. And as a consequence, for your interviews, you really want to get the backgrounds, understand what motivated them, how they experienced their campaigns, what support they got, what obstacles they got. Sorry. And so as a consequence, you're going to be doing a lot of just your contribution is a description of the phenomenon, is documenting it, is providing a historical record in some ways. But then you also want to see, well, are there some things that these people had in common in these experiences that moved them to politics? Or is there something about the community they live in that they share in common or are very different, whatever else? Right? So that's the thing about interviews. And you know what? Let's just look. I think I've covered everything in this lecture without even looking at a single slide. We talked about the art of listening and really being keyed into the person. So we're going to skip this. I always remind people. Hearing versus listening, blah, 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 blah. Come on, Kristi, like empathy, paralanguage. Yes, we know. All right. Then also, the other thing about doing this in the live class is that I would have students have this lecture, and then in the seminar, they would have to conduct an interview and come up with questions and practice listening and then give feedback on the experience because you don't know how something's going to go till you do it. Right. So let's see. Instead of short answers, the interviewer encourages full, rich responses to questions. A wide scope for improvisation. Relevant tangents can be spontaneously developed and followed. You can ask questions in a different order. So yes, the other thing about an interview is you need to know what you want to ask. And you generally want to ask everybody the same questions so you have comparable data. And you want to get through your interview schedule. Your interview schedule is, I'm going to say this first and this second and that third. But you need some flexibility because some people might go off on a story and they start talking about a topic that you ask in question number 8, but they're already talking about it. So in this case, what you'd want to do is you'd want to go, okay, here's question 8. We're already dealing with it. I'm going to jump in and follow up on this now, probe on this now, and then cross 8 off the list. The challenge with interview question schedules is you need to get a sense of how long it takes for each person, or at least a guesstimate when you first start out, how long it's going to take for a person to get through your question. Because if you only have 60 minutes to talk to somebody, or 90 minutes, which would be a ridiculous amount of time for an interview, in my opinion, if you have 60 minutes to talk to somebody one-on-one, you only get halfway through your interview schedule, you're missing half your data. And so there's a real fine line dance sort of negotiation, pacing. The more you do your interviews, you get a better sense of how long people need. And so you can kind of like wrap things up or churn things, so that's the point. And you can do interviews over 2 or 3 meetings if necessary. For instance, if it's a member of parliament from political science, oftentimes there will be someone who shadows them and they want to talk to them at different points. Interviews are generally semi-structured, and semi-structured means you know the questions you want to ask, but you don't have to follow the questions in order, which you have to with the survey. No options. You got to present them in the order that they were structured because they quantitative survey structures or survey questions are ordered in that way for a reason. They're put together to make sure, that there are not recency biases, or if you ask the same question with 2 different words, they need to be far enough apart. There's a lot of rules. There's a lot of stringent controls and a lot of thought that goes into what order questions go in, because if you get information earlier, it can change your answers later on. So, but that's not the case in interviews. It's a very flexible method of getting data. And of course, your aim is to cover all your questions on your interview schedule with each interview. Now, in an unstructured interview, you generally have topics, but you don't have specific questions. Sometimes, if you're talking about a specific phenomenon, let's say that I wanted to interview feminist activists. I might go in an unstructured interview kind of way and just open up the question to, what is feminism to you? Because that might be something I'm looking for in terms of being open to a lot of data. And I might have some general things like activism or whatever else, but even less structured than the semi-structured. An unstructured interview is in some ways more like a conversation, but it's a conversation with a goal. Right. Here's the main difference between the quantitative and qualitative interview schedules. Quants, you have to ask words identically in the same order. You can't expand on a question. You can't rephrase it. And you only get to probe for further information when directed. Whereas in a qualitative interview, you can rephrase your questions or use different words if the person doesn't quite, understand the concept, or you can understand, right? The order of the questions is flexible. You can restate them in a different language, different phrases. You can probe as and when you need. And if you have a tangent that seems really interesting, you're encouraged to go down it in a qualitative interviewing format as opposed to a quants. Right, so I think I've kind of talked. All right, so let's see. 7 stages of an interview from Caval. Thematizing for yourself, formulate the purpose of your investigation, and also have a good idea of the concept of the topic that you want to investigate. I would strongly discourage anyone from going out in the field to find a topic to understand, because if you don't know what you're looking for, then you don't know what you have. Even if you have an instinct as to how things might be structured or might be functioning and are willing to be shown wrong, as in 12th grade or my senior high English teacher used to say, specific is terrific. So have a specific idea, have a definition of a concept or multiple definitions of a concept in mind, have a theme. You want to plan your study. There's all kinds of stages of thinking of your question, recruiting people, collecting the data, transcribing the data, analyzing the data. You have to conduct the interviews with a sense of where you're going, right? And to get them done on time. Then also, you want to create a safe space for people to confide in you and give you their honest opinions and feedback to them to make sure that you're accurately understanding what they have in their heads. Transcribing, which sucks. There's a lot of tools now these days that really changed the transcribing game. It's so much easier now to transcribe a minute worth of text, a minute worth of talk than back in the day, but it's still, then the standards become higher and higher as well. And of course, your analysis. Once you've got your verbal audio data transformed into a written format that you can actually read, then you can go ahead and start doing your analysis. Verifying means you want to ascertain the generalizability, reliability, and validity of the interview findings. One idea here, dependability, is how consistent are your results? Now, there's a whole thing about qual and quants, but if a phenomenon does exist, let's say you're interested in certain experiences of migrant communities, and you, in your interview structure, really focused on Eastern European migrants, for whatever reason, and you found some sort of cultural alienation concept, presumably this is something that could transfer as a concept to describe an unspoken phenomenon in a different community. I mean, an East Asian community. And so here again, it's not about replicating a population, it's about replicating a concept. Credibility, does the theory map onto the observations in an appropriate way? Like, again, you are here doing inductive work, not deductive. But if you had a posited causal mechanism, what in your data is there anything that your data that supports that idea of a causal mechanism? And in addition, did you find any other possible causal mechanisms or interaction effects that might be unknown before or undescribed before? The question of transferability kind of comes back to dependability, about replicating others. Transferability, here's, could someone else go and find your study? So I guess here, let me get reliability in terms of results, consistency in terms of how the researchers conduct the study. So in this case, it would be, can someone else conduct interviews with a migrant population to look for the concept? Credibility, internal validity, does it make sense, the logic of the causal mechanism? Or is it just like, like this thing, magic happens and then we make millions of dollars. If there's like a whole magic happens and you can't describe it, it's not credible. Transferability is that the finding, or I want to say the concepts, can be generalized across settings. Can you find similar concepts in different migrant groups, for instance, coming into the same country? So, sorry about that. Dependability is a replication question. Are you transparent with your methods in your data collection and processing that someone else could redo what you did? Credibility is the way to the extent to which your observations and your theory or your inductive conclusions are based in the data and make sense. Transferability is the extent to which you're picking up on a phenomenon that you can find in another context. The challenge for qualitative researchers in reporting often is how much data to show, because there's like a cherry picking guide, a cherry picking fallacy that you need to be aware of. You need to make sure that you're transparent enough to show that your selections are representative of what people said. They're not cherry picked to give you the best case scenario. And of course, transparency is the best way to do that, is making your data available. Depending on how sensitive the topic is, there are ethical requirements about confidentiality, anonymity, or anonymization, or pseudo-anonymization of your data, and ways that you can protect people. All right. I think I've kind of covered this, thinking outside the box, question flow, following things. So I'm just, for the purposes of this, I'm going to get back. Okay, let's just go over this. For interviewing, some open-ended questions, right? Have you ever, blah, blah, blah. Could you tell me about when you, blah, blah, blah. For more direct questions, you can say, do you agree with this? Do you disagree with that? What makes you feel comfortable here? What makes you feel uncomfortable? Now, there are some, assumptions here, but if you're giving feedback, right, you're building on it. Indirect questions, what do your colleagues think of the recent changes? I generally would go away from this, because you're basically reporting on people's perception of other people's perceptions. And it might be appropriate for your research question. It's not, it's not generally something I talk about in mine a lot. And of course, if you want to move topics, you can say, hey, I'd like to ask you about a different topic. Another important flexibility point is just this, what we call probing, and that's a follow-up question. Someone says something and you're like, oh, could you elaborate on that? Or you can say, you interpret their questions, rephrase it. Is it fair to say that you feel let down by him? And then they can elaborate. Here's another great way to probe. Just be quiet. Someone says something, and instead of jumping in at the end of it, just let it sit for a minute. Because people also have a uncomfortable silence thing they don't like to do. And so they will oftentimes fill in silence with more of their own thoughts. And sometimes people need to sit back and think about stuff. This is way easier to do in person than online. Oftentimes, there are silences in our D&D games. And I'm like, oh, silence. I'll just jump in there and say something. And like, oh, no, actually, maybe they're just formulating some questions. That's easier to do person to person when you've got some feedback and not just audio. But silence is incredibly powerful. All right, if you want to understand some quality criteria about how to do stuff, you can always go ahead and look at this. But for the purposes of moving on, because the recorder things, a lot of the stuff is going to get covered in focus groups too. The last thing I'll say about interviewing is the physical environment, your recording equipment, and your plan for transcriptions, because this will also be the same for focus groups. Planning the environment is huge, right? You're going to need equipment to record stuff. You cannot do a 60-minute interview taking notes. You can't listen and take notes at the same time. You can't be an active listener while you're trying to remember what someone just said. Then you're not really engaging. You're not hearing them. So having a phone, I use all the time in my focus groups. I would just use my mobile phone's recording thing. It's perfectly fine. It works well if you have a good environment. And a good recording environment is one where there's not a lot of background noise. There's not a lot of, like air conditioning or whatever else. Ideally, it's not a big empty hall with a lot of room echo, but you want to make sure that, your physical environment is conducive to your ability to transcribe your data later. And then, so that one, make sure it's working too. Obviously, you don't want to you don't want to like put out a recorder and then it didn't work. In our focus groups, we always double recorded it to have a backup on the offhand. But if you're there, if you open up your phone's recorder on your phone, you can see whether or not it's working. You can see the audio waves being recorded, which is a nice positive feedback I often use to confirm when I was doing phone interviews on that. Don't turn off your recorder at the end. Don't be like, okay, well, thanks for the inner click. Let's have a little chat. Like, just leave it running. If you've got someone permission, obviously you have to get their permission and their informed consent and all that ethical stuff beforehand. People, after the formal interview, they might give you more data. So don't, you put it down as soon as you get permission, because people sometimes will get awkward about being recorded. But if you give them 2 minutes, they'll forget they're recorded unless they keep looking at the microphone or the thing that's recording them. And after it's done, just let it run, because they might give you feedback on your interviews. They might expand on a couple things, and you don't want to try to have to remember that or try to write notes on it. You want to just have it down as data. You might want to jot down things during the interview for the purposes of what I would do it for is when someone uses a phrase that I like a lot, or if someone uses a phrase that I want to quote back to them, I will take notes on tactically things that are said in a focus group or in an interview in order to have that exact wording, but I'm not making notes the whole time. I think that's it. You really do need to be present while you're doing this research. And transcription. Oh my God. All right. So the general rule is 1 hour of interviewing can take 5 to 6 hours to transcribe if you want to do almost word for word. You have times where people are going to be incomprehensible, or they'll say something but they'll mumble it and you might have understood it in the moment, but it's now too faded. So you want to be able to maybe distinguish times when it's an audible or incoherent phrase. You might want to come up with a way that you systemize your coding to help you indicate where emphasis is or where verbal pauses are. You might want to, if you have a video, you might want to, depending on, how rich you want your data to be, indicate when someone has a sarcastic tone, or when they laugh, when they, pause or pull out a picture of their kids. You might want to put that right into the text, because it will, people who read the text won't have your audio. So they only have the data that you give them. Data analysis and transcription are not separate tasks. You're working with the data, so you're going to notice things, make notes while you're transcribing your data as you go, because why wouldn't you? You're already doing data analysis in that process, so go ahead and count it as a first wave of analysis. Let's see, precision in transcribing. The spoken word is different from the written word. People will go on and on and on and on and on for paragraphs. And you definitely want to take breaks on a regular basis, because transcribing work is exhausting, tiring mentally to keep up that level of precision. And you also, there's ways that in your transcription you want to, again, enhance it by, for instance, if someone is discussing changes to the AWS and they mean all women's shortlist, it might be worth writing out these acronyms for people who read it later who aren't going to know all this inside baseball, or providing a key of acronyms used at the top of the document. So what I want to say here is that interviewing is a lot of work. So are focus groups, but the data that are produced can be incredibly rich. So as a, uh, gosh, I don't think I have, no, we won't do it today. But I oftentimes for a focus group, easily we get 30 pages of text by the time we get through. Interviews might be 4 pages of text from just one person. Because again, when it's just one person, they talk way more than they do in a focus group, believe it or not. How are we for time? All right, halfway through. Let me get a chance to take a sip. And also, let's have a look at the chat. I know you all are listening quietly and attentively. I appreciate that. When I was doing my training, Anna says, the transcription of the interviews was really annoying, having to listen to myself again and again while typing out the dialogue. Yes, you have to learn to become detached from listening to yourself. Yes, your own voice. It's the same thing like when you're going to do YouTube videos. Eventually, you just have to treat yourself as a product and be detached and go, okay, like it is what it is. This is my face. This is my voice. Not much I can do about it. So the question is, how can I enhance it or work with what you got? Mm. Have I seen Worski's boxing fight yet? I don't remember. That sounds more like a happy hour thing. ZX or ZXVO. I have some kind of vague recollection he was doing stuff, but I don't remember specifics. But thanks for asking. All right. Focus groups, very similar in a lot of ways. A lot of the things apply to interviews also apply to focus groups. The difference is that you're dealing with more people. Ideally, a focus group will be a minimum of 3, 4. I mean, if you're going to spend an hour and a half talking to people, you have to find this sweet spot in your focus group of sufficient people to warrant the amount of time. Because oftentimes, like we paid people for interviews too. I think last time we might have paid them 15 or 20 for the interview. And an interview goes faster, so it's only like 30 minutes for an interview, but 90 minutes, 60 to 90 minutes for a focus group. The fewer people you have, the more data you can get from each individual. But the fewer people you have, the less data you'll have overall. So focus group's a little bit of a negotiable, navigable type of data collection. This is 1 to 2 hours. I generally don't go more than 90 minutes because I oftentimes end up having to do my focus groups on evenings after work, and people have responsibilities, or I'm doing them on the weekends. And again, people are coming into their responsibilities. So given my budget, like if I could offer someone £100 for 2 hours, I'm sure I'd get really good retention rates. I don't. But 2 hours to me seems like a lot. Seems like a lot of time to be talking with people about a topic. So focus groups are formally organized. They take place outside of a natural setting, whereas you might interview someone in their office or even in their home. Focus groups, you need a table and chairs and paper and pens, and it's very much controlled by the researcher. So we're trying to create a discussion where participants reveal their perceptions and their self-reports. I think we talked a little bit about that. I'm not going to go over the only type of focus group I've really ever seen and also run is just when you have a main moderator and some backup. But dueling moderator, let's see. Front-end studies in researching participant reactions, expectations, attitudes, and interest in the topic. I think this is applications. So you want to screen your focus groups participants. When I do, because there's too much, you can't just ask everybody everything. You need to be a bit targeted. Let me give an example of how to target. It would be unacceptable in a quantitative research agenda to only sample people who are registered to vote, because you can't meaningfully generalize to a population. I mean, you can theoretically generalize to a population of voters. However, people can register to vote. Other people who are registered to vote might not vote. And therefore, you're not really sure exactly to whom you're generalizing, right? That's why you do a random sample, ideally, or you get quota samples that are balanced to be representative of the population at large, because you don't want an inherent bias in your sample. Focus groups, you don't have to worry about that. Interviews too. You're not sampling on a population, you're sampling on concepts. And as a consequence, you only really need a broad enough spectrum of data to demonstrate a concept existing independently, in my opinion, to demonstrate that there is a there. And so in our focus groups, we had a disqualifying factor. A person had to be considering or know that they would vote in the next election. Because at the end of the day, if I'm interested in voters' perception of political party leaders, well, I'm not going to pay someone who's a non-voter to give me data I can't use. Right now, if I wanted to go and talk to non-voters, I could create focus groups of just non-voters. That's nothing stopping me. But you do have to have a little bit of a sense of managing, your research question, which might feel like herding cats. And one of the ways you can do that is narrow down your pool of applicants to really look at only those people who have the causal relationship that you're interested in describing or understanding better. The good thing about focus groups is that you can collect a lot of data from a lot of people. The downside is you get things like people who are more willing to talk and people who take a backseat. And if you've got one, call them like a loudmouth in the group, then everyone else is getting a free ride. They're not giving you data that you need and you're paying them. So you have to control the way that you deliver questions and also physically signal that you're moving on to the next person, or to call on people if they're not volunteering in order to pull answers out of them. There's also the issue of social desirability. People will most likely be less likely to say socially unacceptable things in groups where they feel they're going to be judged. One of the ways that we handled this in the qualitative election study of Britain, as an example in Scotland, was that we were interviewing yes and no voters on Scottish independence. We knew right away, having, like people on the ground in Scotland, we could not put them in a mixed group. We could not put the yes and no voters in the mixed group. And let me tell you why we were right to do that. I think it was a no group. Somebody walked in and went, all right, where are the yes voters? And went, oh, no, sorry, it's all no voters in here. And the guy went, oh, no, I really wanted to change some minds. That's why you gotta screen it, because that guy came with an agenda not to give us data, but to debate a yes voter, right? And that might have intimidated the yes voter to speak less, or the two of them might have just gotten in such a big fight that nobody else talked. So thinking about your sampling can be really, really important. And while he was disappointed he couldn't argue with yes voters, we got some really good data out of the other no voters, because once we said that, everyone in the room knew that they were no voters. And as a consequence, they felt it was more socially acceptable to say bad things about yes voters, if I'm honest. And I don't want to say it's in one direction, right? Yes voters also felt better about saying what they really thought, or their more angry things about no voters. And I know for sure if I was in a group, on a focus group, and everyone in the focus group had either voted Democratic in the last 3 elections or was planning on voting for the Democrats, what I would be willing to publicly say would be quite different than if, there was a MAGA person, because I'm not saying, me, I'm going to say what I'm going to say, but I might phrase it differently, or I might prepare for, a fight. So it is important that you think about the structure and the kind of content that's going to come out of your participants, depending on who you put in your group. So in a focus group, you have less control over the topics because people can wander, but, and again, might not be good for sensitive issues. Heisenberg's famous uncertainty principle. As Heisenberg said, what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. And focus groups, are often useless, according to Ruskoff. I would disagree. Causing more problems than they intend to solve. Respondents aim to please rather than offer their own opinions. Oh God, no! He hasn't met Scottish people. And data is often cherry picked to support a foregone conclusion. I'm not saying that these are true. I'm saying that as a person who does qualitative research, be prepared. You're going to have to answer these questions. And I disagree with all of these. I think focus groups are a fantastic way to get certain types of data, and they're a terrible way to get other types of data. It's just a matter of what question you're asking. As a focus group moderator, you do need to know your topic well, because if someone says something that's theoretically interesting, but you don't know the theory, you can't follow up on it. And as a consequence, yeah, as a social scientist, you're probably going to have to do your own focus groups or interviews because you know the topic better than anyone else. Which, if you have no money, it's not a problem. If you start being able to hire people, you have the option to hire focus group moderators. And I've never had enough money to do that, but I never would. I would never want anyone else to run my focus groups or my interviews because I know the data, I know the study, I know what's come before. And as a consequence, I can make connections on the fly, or I can identify a new thing and probe. So groupthink, you definitely, groupthink is a thing you have to worry about in a focus group. People who start to express an opinion in one direction might then create a situation where people who hold a different view don't want to speak up. So one of the things that we do to get around groupthink is first, the top of our focus groups, we explain, you're not here to convince anybody else in the room. You're here to tell me what you think. And so as a consequence, if you have a problem with a politician or what someone else has said, talk to me, look at me. And there are times I will intervene when someone in a focus group will be saying, like pointing at, like a person who voted for a different party and I talk to me. They're not here as a representative of Gordon Brown or David Cameron or Boris Johnson or whatever else. You're not talking to them. You're talking to me in order to make it clear that whatever your political persuasion is, you're protected here. And you don't have to feel like you need to defend yourself. Another thing that we'll do is say, you're not here to convince anyone else. You're here to give us data. And I will also say, it's really important that if you hear everybody agreeing, let's say that everyone is saying, yeah, I think taxes should go up and spending should go up to support people, and you think the opposite, it's so important to me that you say, actually, I think the government's bloated and I think we need to cut taxes and look for more efficiencies in services. Because if you don't say that, then that's not going to get into my data, and it's really important. So I will encourage, does someone else want to follow up on that, or does someone have a different opinion? In creating a focus group space where it's about expressing, not about debating. It's not Twitter. Focus groups aren't Twitter. Right? So that's something I would say about it. Also, having a norm of moving on, encouraging, like anyone disagree with that, anyone thinks something else. We also do that leaders evaluation. And so we do leaders evaluation where we brainstorm reactions to party leaders. And the first time we do it silently. We say, I want you to look at this picture. It comes from the website of the party itself. So these are party selected images that are part of their PR. Have a look at this person's face and then write down all the things that come to mind. Don't worry about you screening it or if it's silly or whatever else. Just be very, very open about, whatever your associations are with this person. And then go through and write positive, negative, neutral as to how it makes you feel toward them. Then, after they do the silent brainstorming for 5 or 7 or however many political party leaders that we are asking them to react to, we'll say, okay, so when it comes to Boris Johnson, what are some positives you had for Boris Johnson? What are some neutral comments? What are some negatives? And by doing this, you creating this structure where you go positive, neutral, negative, positive, neutral, negative, and you call on people, you create a space where people are understand it's okay to have positive and negative, even if you don't like someone. Or if you do like someone, it's okay to talk about their negatives because everyone's positives, neutrals, and negatives are all going to get talked about. And so this is a way to kind of avoid that groupthink, especially when it comes to we found out talking about politics, people are way more positive in their assessments when they do it on paper and silently written down than when they talk about it. In discussions, people will naturally, it seems, or it's socially encouraged to just say really negative things about politicians. And as a consequence, if you didn't have that written data, if you didn't have a structure where you said, talk about the positives, neutrals, and negatives, then it would look like people are just way more pessimistic and negative about political leaders than they really are in their heads. And so we're thinking around these problems of groupthink. Not how can I undermine groupthink? How can I create a structure where groupthink isn't encouraged or where the opposite is encouraged? I think it's just really good for your data quality. You get more data, you get better data, and then you have, like we had in this situation, you have the difference between what people think and then what people say. And they're not lying, when they say things, they're just conforming to this idea that all politicians are crap. So recruiting your politician or recruiting, I think I talked about that. Recruiting is hard. Recruiting is very hard. If you want to talk to me about recruiting for focus groups or interviews, please contact me privately. I have some ideas, but it's generally going to take a lot of footwork. If you are looking at for an organization, you might have to go and get permission from someone at the top to even conduct the research with their staff before you get involved with deciding who's going to be, in your sample. If you're a student, oftentimes it's just going to be, it might be a convenient sample. And a convenient sample is, hey, these are the people at my university who are willing to talk to me. And to start out, that's fine. It's not like experimental science where in order, if you're doing deductive theoretical testing, then you're going to come into sampling and all this kind of stuff. If you're doing exploratory work, let's go back to trans representation, and you've sent out an interview to, 5 representatives, trans representatives or openly trans representatives, and only 2 get back to you. Well, that's all you can do. But yeah, there has to be some justification in your methodology as to who you talk to, because your sample will also reflect the quality, your data quality will be reflected in your sample. And I'm not saying that if you only manage to talk to 2 people, your study isn't worth doing. It's just, as a reviewer, I would know, okay, well, this is interesting, but this is an initial finding. It's a preliminary exploration. It is highly descriptive. And there's probably very little we can generalize to other representatives who've been elected, who are openly trans, or out trans, or we want to say, but we can't make any structural generalizations yet. We don't have enough data, but that first kernel of data is very important. And then I just kind of discuss a little bit of how to structure focus groups in here, which again, for the purposes of my classes, it was really important to go through all this because they were going to run focus groups. So after their interview lecture, they had to, we paired them up, and I made them do interview schedules and interview each other and, talk about their transcription strategies or whatever else. I remember them having a lot of fun running their focus groups. I'm biased toward focus groups as well, so obviously I was a little bit more enthusiastic on that one. But so as a consequence, there was a lot more feedback. But I think for the purposes of this, if you're interested in more, obviously, the slides are I don't even know how many slides this is. Kristi, why didn't you number your slides? How do you not have the number of slides? Anyway, there are a lot of tactics here that you can use to help you guide you run your first focus group. Run your first focus group as a pilot study or even your first interview. Look, this is it. If you're going to interview somebody for the first time ever, don't have it be a real participant. Do practice interviews. Do practice focus group. If you're really interested in doing this type of research and you've never done it before, I would highly recommend getting a group of people friends, family, whatever, and do a run through, because it's the same thing for the interviews. Make a real appointment, go to a physical place, have your recorder, have your list of questions, right? Or if it's a focus group, set up the tables. Think about it, you're going to have refreshments. Where are you going to put the recorder in the middle of the room so everyone can hear it? How do you know you're speaking loud enough? There's so much that you learn the first time you do it that will help you. So another thing I guess I will just leave off with is that it's key to have a practice run or 2 under your belt before you start. Because if you are recording the focus group and organizing the focus group and paying all your participants, and you're running it, and you're keeping track of the paperwork and the ethical or the informed consent, and you're doing the handouts, right? And you're keeping track of the handouts that they get filled, that is a lot. And then to stay in the moment while you're asking a question and thinking about it's a lot. It's a lot to do, and so give yourself a practice run, I would say. All right. Yeah, so next time, analyzing talk, maybe analyzing text, and then we're going to look at the very nonsensical 1950s video, Date with Your Family, which is peak white bubble patriarchy nonsense. Right, before we go, 10 minutes to the top of the hour. That's perfect. Again, you can always look at my slides underneath if you need more details. Let's have a look at what people are saying. Good morning. Hey, Matt. Good to see you. Worski's boxing fight, only 15 seconds to watch it. Yeah, drop it in on the happy hour. That's a perfect place. I don't think I can mix boxing fights with qualitative research. I appreciate the suggestion. It just sounds more like happy hour material. So, yes, try to get our attention the happy hour, or get to me on Twitter. Send me a DM. And good morning, Matthew. It is good to have you in the chat. You were actually awake at a ridiculous hour, and you are always welcome. So good to see you. Saying that, I'm done. Already talked about what's coming up next week. And yeah, we're going to do a little bit more social science until, I guess, probably about the end of September, first week of October, and then we'll switch back over to politics until the midterm elections. So, until next time, all that's left to be said is, yeah, send me the match on Twitter, and then I'll put it in my bookmarks, and then I can have it for the happy hour. Yeah, I have to nuke my bookmarks so that I've got a clear set for next week, because otherwise they tend to build up. So I'll do that now, right? So if you want to clear all bookmarks, I had already added some new ones, but that's okay. It's just about Matt Gaetz getting a pardon, putting in a pardon request for his trafficking charges. Right. So until next week, all that's left to be said is, I've been Kristi. You've been awesome. Thank you, Adam, for your thanks. Thanks, DN Fan. Thank you for everyone for showing up. Appreciate it. And yeah, I've been Kristi. You've been awesome. Okay. Bye. Good rest of your day too, Matthew. Bye.